Hey guys, alright, today we're going to be watching the Battle of Savo Island, 1942, America's worst naval defeat. Now, I have no clue about this battle. I know nothing, so gonna learn about it. But let's see, 1942, so that'd be about before, depends when this was. This has to be after Midway, though. Um, and I wonder just how bad this naval defeat is. I think that's going to be interesting to hear. August 9th, 1942.
Many believe that after Midway, the
Oh, this is his old mic. Oh my gosh.
Japanese never had the upper hand. But this assertion is plainly wrong. The Japanese may have lost their main carrier force, but they still retained a strong surface fleet.
Yes, exactly. The loss of the Japanese carrier force certainly damaged them a lot, and it's something that they would never be able to replace. Um, Especially compared to American industrial capabilities. But they still had a massive fleet still at hand, as well as a very nice defensive ring in the Pacific for the ships and whatnot.
And it was a force to be reckoned with. On August 7th, America launched its first offensive in the Pacific and landed on Guadalcanal. Japan launched ineffective air raids on the invasion fleet, with poor results. Something more was needed. Admiral Mikawa was in charge of the newly formed 8th Fleet. His force was comprised of 5 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and a single destroyer. As soon as he heard of the Guadalcanal landings, he thought of one thing: attack. The Naval General Staff opposed his plan originally at first, but then reassessed the situation. What other alternative did they have? Let the Americans strengthen their hold? No, the Japanese Navy spirit was that of attack, and they approved Mikawa's bold operation. By 1430, his force departed. His objective? Destroy the enemy force. It would be a quick and devastating thrust, and then he would withdraw into the cover of darkness before American carrier aircraft could retaliate.
A a naval guerrilla attack? Is that what I'm hearing? That sounds pretty
On August
neat.
8th, Mikawa saw Allied planes above, and he knew he had been spotted. Little did he know, he was actually spotted the day before as well, by submarine S-38. Mikawa must have assumed the surprise was lost, but Mikawa received reports that the American fleet was divided into 3 groups in the waters off Guadalcanal, and this gave him hope to continue the mission. If the reports were accurate, he could defeat each group separately. His scout planes assured him he would make it by midnight, and at 11:13 p.m., 3 scout planes were launched ahead of Mikawa's fleet. They would drop flares on the American cruisers during the battle. The Japanese had the finest night binoculars in the world, and at 12:43 caught sight of a destroyer. But this lone destroyer was actually oblivious to their presence and was moving further and further away. His forces reduced speed and pressed on. 50 guns were trained on this little destroyer, ready to blow it out of the water if it sounded an alarm. But nothing. He couldn't believe it. Miraculously, he was able to pass by it undetected. Had he truly achieved surprise? Or maybe it was a trap with the Americans waiting for him. He had no idea what he was about to face. Regardless, he increased speed to 26 knots, and at 1:33 he gave the order: all ships attack. Now, Mikawa couldn't have known it at the time, but he had achieved complete surprise. The Americans were under the command of Rear Admiral Turner. The main force guarding the landings were 4 American cruisers and 2 Australian cruisers. Admiral Crutchley in the USS Australia was in charge of the southern group, and Captain Reefco in the USS Vincennes was in charge of the northern group. So the American fleet would be capable of handling the Japanese, but its fleet was divided into 2, leaving them subject to defeat in detail. Rear Admiral Turner had indeed received all reconnaissance reports of Mikawa's fleet heading towards his area, but the poor chain of communications resulted in him receiving the reports at the end of the day. What didn't help was that there was also a misidentification of the Japanese force, identifying a sea tender with him. So when he did receive the report, he disregarded them. If it was a sea tender, maybe the Japanese were building a seaplane base nearby. Yes, they were near, but the Japanese would never attack during the night, would they? And this is what Turner was guilty of. He was assuming what the Japanese would do and not taking into account their capabilities.
Yeah, All right, yeah, I agree with that maxim. Do not base your plan of actions on what the enemy would do. Base your actions on what the enemy could do. Always assume, in my understanding of tactics, always assume the most that the enemy could do, and give yourself the how I believe they handle war games sometimes is that they give the enemy the best assumptions, the best assumptions of their capabilities and tech and whatnot, and then you give your side like the worst or whatever, or an average, right? You give yourself like an average or below average capabilities, and see how well you do or whatever. I don't quite know because I'm not in the military, so I never experienced war games, of course. So I haven't researched them. So if I'm wrong on how war games work, correct me. But I think that's kind of how they work a little bit. Obviously not entirely how they work, but I think that's kind of how they work. But why would the Japanese have attacked at night before? Especially, maybe not in a naval attack. They've not done it at night, but certainly if they are willing to do raids at night in combat, in ground fighting, why wouldn't they do it in the sea? Like, oh.
In other words,
And especially if your own scout planes, also caught sight of the Japanese fleet, wouldn't you want to prepare more properly for a potential attack to come at any time, right? I mean, obviously, I'm not gonna diss this admiral here because, well, he received a good education, but just a misstep here, man.
his battle plan was based on what the enemy would do, not could do. Thus, nothing was done to raise the alert status of his ships. Also, the Americans were too dependent on radar, betting that they would be able to spot the enemy from afar if it chose to attack.
Yeah, it
But they
sounds
were
like the
unfamiliar with the
Americans.
usage of radar at this point of the war, and it would fail them during the battle. This explains their overconfidence in just placing 2 single destroyers on picket duty. To make things worse, a huge gap would form between them when they were at their furthest point apart, and by pure luck, this is where Mikawa was able to squeeze through undetected.
Huh.
It's also important to
What
note
timing?
that the cruisers had been at general quarters for the past 15 hours, so this night, the exhausted crews would finally be given rest and be placed in Condition 2 readiness, meaning that battle stations would be partially manned. And to top all of this off, Admiral Crutchley was summoned for a conference, and the USS Australia pulled out of formation at 9:23 p.m. The cruisers were now without an admiral. Not only that, but the Northern Force wasn't even aware of the fact that their commander was away. What resulted was a broken and confused chain of command during the battle.
Wow.
As you can see,
This is just perfect, like a perfect set of circumstances for the Japanese.
were so many flaws in the
Damn.
command structure and dispositions of the American fleet that tragic consequences were sure to follow.
This is
Mikawa
crazy.
approached. A wounded destroyer, the Jarvis, was coincidentally passing through, exiting the area due to earlier damage from the air raids. The Unagi separated to deal with the ship. Americans could hear planes hovering above. Many thought they were friendly aircraft, but some correctly deduced that they were enemies. The Patterson spots the Japanese and reports, "Warning, warning, strange ships entering harbor." But it is too late. Torpedoes were already on their way. Battle commenced at 1:43 a.m. A moment later, flares from those mysterious planes were dropped, illuminating the American ships. Then the Japanese battle column begins to rain fire on the Canberra and Chicago. From only 4,500 yards, Chokai opens fire on the Canberra. Then Aoba, Kako, and Furutaka join in. The Canberra never had a chance. She was hit by as many as 24 shells.
Damn.
Her engine room was struck, propulsion and power were lost, and her captain was killed. Fortunately, no torpedoes hit her, and she was left dead in the water. The Chicago veered off and saw torpedoes coming her way. She dodged the first 2, but the third torpedo, fired by the Kako, hit her on her starboard bow. She had forward flooding, no power, and was struck on her foremast by a 6-inch shell. Her reaction was slow. Her main guns never got a chance to fire, but her secondary guns scored a hit on the Tenru, causing casualties.
Yeah, let's go
She
Chicago.
retired to the west and was out of the fight. Inexplicably, she does not report or send a warning to the Northern Force.
Oh, god damn it, Chicago.
The Southern force had been defeated in 7 minutes. For the most part, the destroyers were ignored. Vaguely launched an ineffective attack and broke off to the west. The Patterson bravely engaged 3 cruisers between 1:51 and 1:55 a.m. She hit nothing, but in return got hit in the after gun mount and fell back. Unintentionally, Mikawa's column splits into 2, and the Iron Juggernaut has now become a 2-headed monster, and in between the 2 heads lies the Northern force. They launched torpedoes and closed in. The Japanese lit up the Northern fleet, whose guns were still trained forward. They could see men running on their decks. Only a few token men were aware of what was going on, but the majority of American sailors were still confused and believed they were being lit by friendly ships. Near misses fell upon Astoria. She was ordered to engage, but the captain ordered a ceasefire, still thinking they were friendly ships. Chokai's 5th Savo finally hit her. Successive salvos followed and struck her bow, gun deck, and bridge. She managed to fire back, but was ineffective. She lost steering control and her hangar was hit. The Americans would soon discover that their cruisers had a weakness. Their float planes, located on the well deck and hangar, were the Achilles heels on their ships. The gasoline, lubricating oil, ordnances, and all other flammable contents were concentrated and exposed in this area, which greatly contributed to feeding the fire. The Astoria tried to fight the fires, but the sailors soon discovered that there was no pressure on her water lines. She almost collided with the Quincy, who was suffering a similar
This is
fate.
just a mess.
In total, she received
gosh.
34 to 63 hits. Aoba, Kinugasa, and Kako finished her off. She was left a burning wreck. The Quincy was raked along her entire length. Propulsion was killed when she was struck by 2 torpedoes on her port side. The bridge was hit and her captain was killed. She had 5 planes on board. The catapult was struck and her planes went up in flames. She quickly became an inferno, and yet she was able to fight back. She got off 3 salvos and hit Chokai's bridge, nearly taking out Mikawa and his staff. About 54 hits were registered on the blazing cruiser.
Damn.
Just so you can get an idea of how intense the fires were, the Japanese turned off their searchlights because the flaming ships were illuminating the combat area so well. The head of the northern group, the Vincines, took a beating. She was struck by 74 shells from both the eastern and western column. Every single one of her turrets were hit and taken out, testifying to the Japanese's accuracy and precision. Shells struck the main stem lines, the fire main, and battery control. And the conning tower was hit, severing communications on the ship. Her hangar lit up, and to make matters worse, 2 torpedoes hit her port side. The steering power failed, the electrical system failed, and the flagship of the northern group began to fight for her life. The destroyers played no significant part in the battle. The helm practically missed the battle, and the Wilson fired but didn't register any hits. The only obstacle left for Mikawa was the Ralph Taube. Tenru and Furutaka engaged the destroyer. Yubari joined in, and 5 hits were scored. Fortunately, a rain squall saved the destroyer from assured destruction. The damage was catastrophic. The Quincy was the first to sink, 30 minutes after the battle had started. She sank at 2:38 with 370 lives. The Vincines sank at 2:58, taking 332 of her crew. It almost looked as if the Canberra might be saved, but internal explosions began to rattle the Australian ship at 4:15, and it was soon decided that she would be scuttled. She sank at 8 a.m. 85 men died. The last to go was the Astoria. She sank by the bow at 12:15. 216 sailors went down with the ship. Japanese losses were minimal, 35 men killed and 51 wounded. This was the worst defeat of the United States Navy. The final tally: 4 cruisers sunk, 1 cruiser damaged, and 2 destroyers damaged. 1,077 men killed, 709 wounded. Let this sink in. Almost as many sailors died this day than Marines during the entire 6-month Guadalcanal campaign.
Oh my god. I never Oh my gosh. That is a brutal loss. Wow. I've never seen this stat before.
That's how vicious
Wow.
this battle was. It had been a stunning victory. The enemy forces were destroyed, and from it emerged an opportunity to turn this tactical victory into a strategic one. The transports were now exposed and vulnerable. Mikawa still had 40% of his ammunition and 50% of his torpedoes left. But it is worth mentioning that Mikawa's pre-battle plans did not mention attacking transports. Nevertheless, the transports represented tempting targets. Should he go back? Mikawa calculated the risk. The single hit on Chokai by the Quincy was truly a lucky shot. It destroyed the charts and maps Mikawa needed to navigate safely. But the biggest concern was time. Dawn was not far off. It would take 2 hours to reassemble, leaving only 1 hour of night to attack. If he attacked now, he wouldn't be withdrawing back home with the protection of darkness. He would be exposed in daylight hours. He would have to face the wrath of American carrier airplanes during his retreat. He deliberated, and at 2:23, he ordered a withdrawal. Another factor involved was that the Japanese Imperial Army had boasted how they would defeat the Americans soon enough. His mission was to take care of the Navy, which he did, and they would take care of the Marines. So why risk his fleet? The irony, however, was that the American carrier force, the one he was so scared of, was already on its way out of the operational area. If he had gone through with the plan and destroyed the transports, his force would have been able to escape unmolested. This is one of the greatest what-ifs of the Guadalcanal campaign. But who could blame him? We today have the benefit of hindsight, while Mikawa had to act on the information at hand. However, some may argue that he still should have taken the opportunity. Author Mark Still wrote, Mikawa did not know it at the time, but he had just squandered the IGN's best chance of delivering a knockout blow to the first American offensive in the Pacific. It is hard to imagine the Americans holding on to their lodgment following the destruction of their transport fleet and the supplies still on board. The destruction of the American transports would have been worth the sacrifice of Mikawa's entire...
Yeah, I'm gonna disagree with that. The Japanese could not replace those ships as easily as the Americans can replace their losses. Japanese don't have the capabilities, even at this time, even though it's still early on in the war, to replace any losses. They can certainly replace men a little bit easier than they, obviously a whole lot easier than they can replace ships. But yeah, losing the men and ships is way too high of a cost for because the Americans can just replace it. The Americans have the capability to replace the men lost there and the transports lost there. It's just that it would look bad in American media if it got known. That's about it.
Force. This battle had demonstrated to the Americans that the IGN surface fleet still packed a mean punch, and that the Japanese were superior in night fighting. The Battle of Savo Island would be the first of many intense battles for control of the waters off Guadalcanal. And as a final note, a measure of revenge was obtained upon the Japanese the next day. The Kako was sunk by submarine S-44 on her return trip. However, remember the damaged destroyer that made it out of the battle before it started? The Jarvis? She was on her way back to Australia for repairs when 31 Japanese planes approached. She was sunk with all hands. It was going to be a vicious campaign indeed.
At the end? Just black screen? Okay.
Kai by the Queen.
Let's just
At the
do that. Alright. That was the Battle of Savo Island. I've not heard of this battle before, so it was nice to learn about it. If you guys have any suggestions for what you want to see me react to next, go ahead and leave a comment down below. And hope you guys enjoyed. And I'll see you guys in the next video.